Welcome to this webcast, which is part of the LeadWire series on eating disorders. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Guido Frank, who is Professor of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, and also Director of the Medical Behavior Unit at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. Professor Frank, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Professor Frank, you have a very interesting and interdisciplinary approach to your research on eating disorders. Can you tell us about how you combine psychiatry, brain sciences, and biology in your work?
Eating disorders are very complex psychiatric problems with a broad range of behaviors, from food restriction to overeating to self-induced vomiting, excessive exercise across those disorder subtypes. There's a very broad range of associated problems such as anxiety, depression. We're still trying to figure out how exactly do neurobiology and behavior that we as clinicians see in clinical practice, how do they interact and interface? And what is particularly striking is when you work with individuals with eating disorders, there seems to be a drive, a certain motivation to perpetuate the behavior. And when I say drive and motivation, I'm not saying this is all volitional or this is all that people just want to perpetuate that, because many individuals, they want to recover. Yet something seems to be happening that makes it very difficult to recover. And this drive then often leads to eating disorders being very chronic disorders. And then that begs the question, so what perpetuates those motivations to engage in eating disorder behaviors despite their deleterious effects? Many people have electrolyte abnormalities. They may have low bone density. Many of them may be in the hospital for long periods of time. So what are maybe biological factors that contributes to those extremes of under and overeating, exercise, things like that? And it often has been called treatment resistance, right? So it's very, very difficult to engage, obviously, with therapists to then change behavior. And where's the intersection between measurable biology and these illness factors? Drive and motivation are very good concepts to study in eating disorders, in fact, because basic science and psychology and neuroscience have taught us a lot how these neurocircuits in the brain work, how they interact, also taught us a lot about neurotransmitters involved. And when you think about motivation, I like to separate it in two different ways. There is on one hand side the conscious motivation, you have something in mind, but then there's also an unconscious motivation, some biological mechanisms that help you make good decisions. And let's say you're hungry, then there's an area in the brain called the hypothalamus who integrates bodily signals about maybe how well fed you are or not. And then somehow you get information to your consciousness that says, okay, I'm hungry and I should get some food, right? Or I'm cold and I should get a blanket. And those unconscious and conscious motivations, they are supposed to work together to sustain the organism and then typically create a rewarding experience for you. You're fed, feels good, right? You're warm, feels good. In eating disorders, there seems to be something off, so to speak, because on one hand side, we have a conscious motivation that is driven by fear of weight gain, drive for thinness, extreme body dissatisfaction, and that then motivates people to restrict or binge eat and purge. And on the other hand, then there's the question, where is the unconscious motivation here? And are there maybe abnormal circuits for satiety or hunger, for reward processing and food approach? And are there maybe both ends of the conscious and the unconscious motivation, are there deficits, let's say, or disturbances that then work together to create an unhealthy motivation and unhealthy rewards. You're not getting rewarded by eating food, but rather by seeing a lower number on your scale, or having the idea, I may have lost some weight, which then perpetuates the illness. So these are sort of background concepts. And what basic science has shown us are important interactions between brain regions such as the frontal cortex, the insula that are sort of more on the outside, that process this conscious motivation, how we feel ourselves in the body, and then how they interact with deeper brain structures like the basal ganglia or brainstem, where neurons for chemicals like dopamine sit, for instance, and how they drive us. Parkinson's here's a good example, because we know that Parkinson's disease is associated with dopaminergic cells, and they deteriorate, and then you have problems with initiation and behavior, and that has taught a lot about how these brain regions interact. My lab, to go then to your last part of that question, in terms of neuroscience and how it interacts with the work we're doing, how we approach it is we have focused on a brain chemical called dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that helps with initiation and sort of driving behavior. But it's also an important, it's called motivational salience signal. So when there's something happening in your life that is important and that is unexpected, then dopamine activation happens, because dopamine is important for you to learn what type of situations are important, and then situations you want to approach and you want to have more of, versus situations you rather avoid, and next time you maybe go out of their way. And you can study this circuitry, this dopamine-related circuitry. Ideally, you look at the receptors, but in the human brain and associating with behavior is very difficult. But what you can do is you can have somebody undergo a brain scan where you look at blood flow in the brain, and that individual then in the scanner does tasks that stimulate the dopaminergic circuitry. So that's how we then have approached that to bridge behavior and in terms of motivation and drive with an underlying neurobiology.
Great. And you recently published an article on eating disorders in JAMA Psychiatry. Can you tell us a bit about what question or questions you set out to answer when you began that work, and what findings you think are most important in that paper?
The work on motivation and drive in smaller studies has led to various hypotheses. And what we have found is that in individuals with anorexia nervosa, those individuals had a stronger dopamine-related response, whereas in individuals with bulimia nervosa and obesity, they had a less strong dopamine-related response, suggesting that when you're underweight, you sensitize the circuitry, and when you binge eat and maybe become overweight, then you desensitize the circuitry. It's a little bit like an addiction model, where you have a lot of substance that a person consumes, and then you desensitize the dopaminergic circuitry, and then anorexia nervosa in a certain way as the anti-addiction model. So raising questions, how much maybe you change your brain by engaging in those eating disorder behaviors. And that's an important aspect, also an important aspect to raise with families or patients, to make it clear that the eating disorder has strong biological effects. And then once you have changed your neurobiology in the elevated or lower range, it might be very difficult to come back, so to speak, within your normal range. The second important result that those smaller studies had shown was that individuals with anorexia nervosa, they had a different connectivity, how different brain structures activated each other. And what we did is we had individuals taste sugar in the scanner, sugar that they, in that case, knew they would get. And in the healthy controls, there was a connectivity, an effective connectivity. It's called sort of a direction of activation from one region to the next, from the hypothalamus to the ventral striatum. And the ventral striatum is one of these dopaminergic terminals that helps with driving behavior. But the hypothalamus, you may remember, is one of these areas that integrate your internal state in the body. And that would be the expected direction, that you taste something and then the hypothalamus transmits information to other brain regions to make you maybe aware how your satiation state is. In folks with anorexia nervosa, the direction was the opposite. So it was from the ventral striatum to the hypothalamus. And basic science, animal research has shown that there is a connection from the ventral striatum to the hypothalamus that is dopamine receptor mediated, and that helps to override hunger when you're in danger. So let's say you're sitting on the park bench and you're having a sandwich for lunch, and all of a sudden some dangerous event happens. Then it's in your best interest to just drop the sandwich and run and go for safety, let's say. And this mechanism helps to override your hunger drive, to stop eating and help you run. And what we believe is that in those individuals with anorexia nervosa, sugar during the experiment, but in the bigger picture, food in general has become a conditioned fear-inducing stimulus that then triggers the circuitry to override the appetitive drive and help those individuals stop eating. Although, of course, it has been hijacked by the illness, by these extremes, fear of getting fat, and then also drive defensive and dread behaviors towards food. So having those two potential mechanisms in mind, we then wanted to see whether or to what degree they apply to the larger eating disorder population, meaning not just looking at a disorder, a subtype at a time, but looking at a large group of folks with eating disorders and see whether across the board we can come up with a model that would help us better understand eating disorders and how behavior interacts with neurobiology. And we hypothesized that this dopaminergic related reward response is called the prediction error. You can study the sensitivity of the dopaminergic circuits, but it's called a transdiagnostic marker. So a biological marker that spans across the eating disorder subtypes. And the idea was based on the smaller studies that is elevated in low weight disorder groups and decreased in high weight disorder groups. And that then this reward measure correlates with body mass index and maybe also behaviors such as bulimia type behavior, such as binge eating. And then there's a third aspect, and that is, it is striking that when you work with individuals with eating disorders, that even when they engage more in the behavior, it seems never be satisfying. Somebody with anorexia nervosa loses maybe a lot of weight, but it's kind of never enough. And the fear of gaining becomes even worse. And that's probably part of the vicious cycle that perpetuates that. But how it exactly works and is driven is that's not clear. I published a paper a few years ago on motivation to eat and not to eat, where I discussed that for anorexia nervosa. And we were hoping that in this study we could shed more light on these relationships. What might be sort of driving this chronicity of the eating disorder and the difficulty to abstain. And then for this study, we recruited a large number of individuals with eating disorders and healthy controls. And after diagnostic and behavioral assessments, they underwent brain scanning. And how it exactly works with this reward response is they sit in the scanner or lay in the scanner, and they learn to associate pictures, they're colored shapes essentially, with taste stimuli. And it can be sugar water, water that tastes like nothing, or in fact nothing. And it's called a Pavlovian learning paradigm. So you have an unconditioned stimulus, the sugar water, the water or nothing, and then the colored picture, the colored shape becomes a conditioned stimulus. And sometimes when individuals think they get the sugar water, they get nothing, and sometimes when they think they get nothing, they get the sugar water, creating this unexpectancy response. And then we use a method called computational modeling. That is, we know from basic science how the dopamine neurons ideally respond. And for each trial, we create a number, so to speak, for this prediction error, for the strength of responsiveness. And then we correlate that with the brain response. And then we can see, well, A, are the right areas active or relating to it, sort of as a validation of our method? And second, which group responds weaker or stronger? And then we measure the brain response on several regions that we predefined, let's say the basal ganglia, the ventral striatum, the orbital frontal cortex, to have a standard way of looking at the regional brain response. And in that study then, what we found was that there was a very strong relationship between the prediction error response and body mass index. Body mass index is a measure for weight to height. And the higher the body mass index, the more you weigh typically, but then again, you take your height into consideration, right? To standardize more. So the lower the weight, the higher the dopaminergic response. The higher the weight, the lower the dopaminergic response. And then the more people engaged in binge eating, the lower the brain response. So we could also tie it to behavior that people reported. And in terms of brain connectivity, we could show that, or show evidence that across the whole board of eating disorder folks, they all try to engage this food control circuitry. It seemed like for all of them, when they were getting the sugar stimulus, they seem to engage the circuitry to override the hypothalamic appetitive stimulus, let's say. And then there was another important aspect that was that the stronger the dopaminergic reward response was, the stronger the ability was to override the hunger cues. And which is peculiar, right? Because the ones who were underweight, they had the higher dopaminergic response, and they were able to even better override the appetitive drive, right? So it becomes sort of, you might want to say unreasonable, right? You're already underweight, and then you even better can override that. Versus the ones who were overweight, their food control circuitry was actually even weaker. And we also found that higher food control circuitry was related to feeling out of, eating makes me feel out of control, in a way that people who were stronger in the food control circuitry, they felt less out of control. And here's an important aspect. It was not feeling out of control over eating. It was feeling out of control in life. And there's a questionnaire called the Eating Expectancy Inventory that measures that. And we could show in a publication earlier this year that while individuals are very clear aware whether they not can control eating, that's not the problem. But eating makes them feel out of control in terms of their productiveness, makes them feel out of control managing their life, which is a very peculiar relationship. Why that is, I cannot say. But this is a phenomenon that I think we need to understand better, and that we have to understand in different ways. But maybe I can quickly put together the model that we came up for how eating disorders work, based on the results of the study. So you might start out with a conscious motivation to change eating, having distress for whatever reason, have negative emotions. And that, together with anxious or perfectionistic personality traits, then might drive you towards extremes of feeling afraid of getting fat, extreme body dissatisfaction, and extreme fear of weight gain. It seems like perfectionism drives those unhealthy aspects. And if you're very afraid of weight gain, then food becomes this conditioned, fear-inducing stimulus that triggers the food control circuitry via dopamine circuits. Now, on the other hand, if you have impulsive traits or anxious traits, they may drive you more towards the either binge eating direction with weight gain, or the food restriction direction with weight loss. Now, what happens then? If you lose a lot of weight, that likely will sensitize your dopaminergic circuits in the ventral striatum, versus the folks who binge eat and gain weight, it will desensitize your dopaminergic circuits. Okay? And then if you have those sensitized dopaminergic circuits, then you have an elevation, you have a strengthening of the food control circuitry and dread response towards food, because they're all connected through the dopaminergic system. On the other hand, if you have a desensitized dopaminergic circuitry, your food control circuitry gets weaker. Now, if you have a sensitized dopaminergic circuitry, you have this elevated food control circuitry that reinforces food restriction because you get better and better at it. You also feel being in control of your life, which is, right? We all want to feel control over our life, makes us feel good. Versus the folks who are already eating a lot, let's say, or binge, they have lower dopaminergic sensitivity and a weaker control circuitry. They try to control eating maybe during the day, but it's not sustainable. And then they may have a reinforcing of binge eating then sort of at the end of the day.
Treating eating disorders is extremely difficult, but based on your research and also your clinical experience, do you maybe have some good advice for practitioners that may watch this webcast?
Yeah, that's really what this is all about. And thank you for asking this question. So there are several aspects that I think are really important. For one, just from a general perspective, I think it's really important to have a multidisciplinary team, just as a side note, with psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, dietitian, the medical doctor, that's really important because these disorders are deadly. They cause a lot of problems, and I think you really need a whole team of practitioners to help individuals to improve. With respect to this research and science, I think what has been very important in my experience is helping individuals understand how the brain works in those conditions. And for many or maybe most of us, the idea of not eating or throwing up the food that you just ate seems counterintuitive, right? Why would I starve myself to the degree I might in fact die or not want to process the food? So it's very difficult to understand. And that's why I think it's particularly important to use those models to help people understand what happens in the brain and what happens that this becomes such a difficult process to normalize. Because many people, I told you about this treatment resistance that many people have written about. You know, it's difficult. It's difficult for the patient. It's difficult for family members. It's difficult for the providers. And I think understanding those models and how it works, I believe, goes a great way and a long way in terms of helping with empathy and, again, getting your strength together to work on your own recovery or help your loved one. Other aspects are, and that goes sort of in a more specific treatment directions, how can we normalize those circuits? And there is no medication that has been approved for anorexia nervosa. There is one approved for bulimia nervosa, which is high-dose fluoxetine, and lisdexamfetamine for binge eating disorder. Although the long-term effectiveness is can be variable. We have been trying to look at treatment from the perspective that I feel medication probably will not cure per se the eating disorder, or will not just fix it, to use that type of casual language. But I think it can have a very important role as a catalyst, a very important role as a helper to support psychotherapy and make this easier. And so we have been thinking about dopaminergic medication to help in that process. And there is medication that might, on one hand side, help with high distress and anxiety in the moment, that blocks dopamine D1 and D2 receptors at the same time, versus dopamine receptor stimulation to maybe either desensitize some of these circuits or help with cognitive flexibility. Because what has been shown in animal research is that when the animal loses a lot of weight, the sex hormones go down, the dopaminergic tone goes down, learning is impaired in a certain way. And then when you stimulate the dopamine system, you can improve this learning aspect. So I probably have to be careful with what I suggest, because these are not FDA approved medications per se, but for the acute distress, medication called olanzapine has been quite helpful, although we're not seeing sort of improvement in food approach and then per se eating more. Although there's a study in an outpatient sample that it did help some with food intake. And another medication called aripiprazole, which is a partial dopamine receptor agonist, which we use in very small dosages usually in conjunction with high quality psychotherapy, which would be family-based therapy for adolescents and cognitive behavior therapy for adults, in conjunction with meal support and the dietitian and individual psychotherapy to help facilitate engaging in the psychotherapeutic process and and then help eventually to get out of the disorder.
Professor Frank, thank you so much for your time today, for speaking on this subject. And I wish you all the very best and continued success with both your work and your research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.